But to start off, we'll take someone who I have known since the first day I came here at UPEI, and when you start thinking in terms of, double digits that start with 2, you're thinking, how long have I been here? But Rick Cawthorn has been here longer than I, so it's a pleasure to have an opportunity to bring him to one of our research breakfasts, and a pleasure to have him have an opportunity to speak to you about the things he knows and loves so well. Rick Cawthorn is a professor of parasitology at the Department of Pathology and Microbiology at the Atlantic Veterinary School, and he received his BSc, his MSc, and his PhD all from the very well-known in veterinary circles University of Guelph. He was a parasitologist at the Western College of Veterinary Medicine in Saskatchewan for a few years, and then in 1985 he came to UPEI as one of the first of the many wonderful faculty who inhabit the world of the Atlantic Veterinary School. In PEI, his primary research focus has been on parasitic protozoa of fish, including the crustaceans and the bivalves and the finfish. He has an extensive list of peer-reviewed publications and reviews, and he is continuing a major research program on crustacean health. In fact, he has been leading the major research program on crustacean health since 1994. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rick Cawthorn.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Richard. As Richard says, I've been on Prince Edward Island since 1985 when we first established Atlantic Veterinary College, and I've had the great pleasure of continuing to work in that environment. My training is in parasitology, so fleas and ticks and worms, that's our bread and butter. In recent years, probably since 1994, we began to focus on crustaceans, initially on lobsters, and so we established the ABC Lobster Science Center in 2000. And more recently, we have expanded our program to consider snow crabs. Our mandate at the center is to apply the principles of veterinary medicine to lobsters and also related crustacean fisheries and aquacultures, and that's what we will talk about with snow crabs. So the topic is your snow crab bitter? And I'll explain what I mean by that and what does this mean for Atlantic Canada. So snow crabs are one of the largest crustacean fisheries in the world. It's a cold water fishery. Many of you are aware of the Deadliest Catch program, so we do collaborate with people in the Alaska where there is an extensive snow crab fishery. In Atlantic Canada, our fishery, the snow crab fishery, is number 2 to lobsters. It's about a $400 million a year industry, as I'll show you. We also recognize snow crabs are fished off Greenland and also off the east coast of what was formerly the Soviet Union. In 2008, the landed values of the crustacean fisheries are as you see. Although we recognize lobsters to be the king of seafood, the snow crabs are pretty close behind, and so it is the second most important fishery in Atlantic Canada, and then the northern shrimp is number 3 with $300 million in landed value. So the landed value is probably 1/2 of what the total export value is of our crustacean fisheries, so the snow crab fishery is a very, very important fishery to our part of the world. And surprisingly, even on Prince Edward Island, the landed value of snow crab is about $12 million. For those of you familiar with the aquaculture industry, that's about 1/3 the landed value of the mussel industry. But where the primary fishery is in Newfoundland, Labrador, where it's about $200 million a year. And also you can see in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and also Quebec, snow crabs are an important fishery. In the ABC Lobster Science Center, although we are in Atlantic Canada, we also work in the province of Quebec with some of our initiatives. So when we go and look at snow crabs and parasites and bitter taste and this type of thing, we have to focus on the host, the parasite, and the environment, and sometimes disease or adverse health can result when the alignment occurs. When we deal with snow crabs, we know relatively little about them from a health perspective. We know relatively little about the parasites that occur in snow crab, and we certainly know a little bit about the environment in which snow crabs occur. So one of the factors that we have to consider when we're dealing with crustacean fisheries or any fisheries at this time of the year or at this time in the world's development is the topic of global climate change. Whether you believe that it's occurring or not, we think it is in terms of how global climate change is impacting the oceanic environment. So remember, we're at this part of the world, Atlantic Canada, and also, as you see, we're also interacting with our colleagues over on the west coast of North America. So this is the Bering Sea, where there is snow crabs, And when you have global climate change, whether it's warmer or colder, this adds stress to the fish, to the crab. Crabs have a narrow tolerance of temperature in which they like to live. Snow crabs like -2 to 5 degrees Celsius. Anything below that or above that, and they get pretty cranky. And when they get cranky, they get stressed, so that if you have a parasite enter into the picture, a stressed crab is more susceptible to infection and disease. We also recognize that when global climate change occurs, the range of the parasites can increase or decrease. We now recognize with warming oceanic temperatures that the parasite which causes bitter crab is probably expanding its range because it likes to be warm as opposed to the crab which likes to be cold. We also recognize that when global climate change occurs, it can affect how a host responds. Some animals respond better when temperatures get warm, others respond better when temperatures get cold. So global climate change is very complex, despite what you may read in the newspapers and see on the TV. Then you also have to look at the host itself, the snow crab. Snow crabs have a very complex life cycle. In our fishery, it's a male-only fishery, so when we go and set the traps, we're only allowed to take male crabs, and they have to have a carapace width of greater than 95 millimeters. It takes about 8 years for a crab to hatch and become into a legal recruit into the fishery. So in the case of the snow crab, in contrast to lobsters, where a female lobster and a male lobster often are the same size, for successful mating, the male lobster has to be much bigger than the female. In our facilities, many of you are aware we have had a major expansion at the Atlantic Veterinary College led by our former dean, Tim Ogilvie. So now we have a new aquatic animal facility, and it allows us to hold crabs at very cold temperatures. So we hold small crabs. This one is only about 1 year old. And we also hold larger crabs, these ones are approximately 6 years old. And we hold them at 0 degrees Celsius, plus or minus half a degree. So it's very expensive, but it's the only way that we can maintain these crabs in a healthy environment. They like, as I say, -2 to 5 degrees. And the biologists we work with say keep them at 0 degrees, and that's what we do. The other comment I would make about parasites, and this leads into bitter crab, is that parasite life cycles can be very simple, going from fish to the bottom and back. Other life cycles are very complex, going from fish into this stage, around some more other things. So parasites, you cannot categorize them as one way or the other. Sometimes the life cycles are simple, and sometimes they're very complex. But how do you know when a crab is healthy? This is the definition that I use for health and the definition of disease. Dr. Boyd was a human medical pathologist. This is the definition I use, very simple, that I teach the veterinary students too. But how do you know when a snow crab, and this one's on the bottom and this one's up on the tub, how do you know when it's healthy? And that's the basic question we have when we start to work on parasites of crabs or lobsters, is how do you know when the animal is healthy? And so a lot of the research we do is geared to trying to answer that question, which gives us a starting point when we add a parasite to the mix. We're fortunate, again, as I reiterate, we now have a new research annex. This is the suite of offices dedicated to the ABC Lobster Science Center, and there is a team of 22 of us, by the way, in that facility at the present time, and this is one of our laboratories. So we're very fortunate that we're able to work with state-of-the-art facilities on the campus. So what is bitter crab disease? The crab on the top is a good, healthy crab. The crab down below is one that has the infection which causes bitter crab. What that means is that when you cook this crab, which has white blood in it, as opposed to clear blood in a healthy crab, that the meat will taste like aspirin. So it'll have a very bitter taste. And the bad news is that if you cook this crab in with a lot of other crabs, that bitter crab taste will go into all the other crabs in the batch. The good news is in Atlantic Canada, as we harvest the crabs in the summer primarily, in Atlantic Canada, in Newfoundland, Labrador, and in our part of the world, before the parasite develops to the point where the crab will taste bitter. The problem is, for those of you who watch The Deadliest Catch, they harvest the snow crab in the wintertime when the parasite has developed to the point where it causes the bitter taste in the crab. But more and more we are seeing this infection and the parasite in our crabs in Atlantic Canada. So what causes bitter crab? It's a parasite with a fancy name. And we recognize it causing bitter crab disease or pink crab syndrome. The crabs turn pink, or the crabs, snow crabs and other kinds of crabs. The nasty part of this is we recognize the parasite occurs in warm water, cold water, and temperate climates, and it's literally exploding around the world. As I'll show you in a minute, we first saw the parasite in 1930 in France, but it wasn't until 1985 that the thing exploded literally around the world, and we now recognize this occurs in more than 40 species of crustaceans around the world, many of which are commercially important. And I know that Minister Leclerc is here, and I've discussed this with him before. We know this parasite does occur in snow crabs, and we also know that snow crabs and lobsters overlap. And from a parasitologist point of view, I hope that the parasite can go from the snow crab to lobsters, because that means we'll get more research money down the road trying to control this infection. Not a good thing for the fishery, but those of us who work on infectious disease, we thrive on non-health. We thrive on disease. So anyway, how do we go and sample these snow crabs? Well, the snow crab is a deep water animal, lives out in the oceanic environment anywhere from 40 meters out to 500 or 700 meters in depth. So one of the ways we do that is we charter commercial fishing vessels, big trawlers, bring them on board, and then we sort the snow crabs. Another way of doing this is to use research vessels from Fisheries and Oceans. And I left this quote on board in particular with the colleagues we work with in Newfoundland, Labrador, is we know that bitter crab disease does cause mortality in these crabs, but we don't know its impact yet, and that's part of what we're looking at. So we can also use pots, bring the crabs on board. And the big challenge we have is this crab is healthy. These two apparently are unhealthy. And if you cut them open, this one's healthy, these two are unhealthy, but that's very, very, very subjective. Even to the trained observers that we put on board these research vessels, these observations are very, very, very non-specific. So what we've developed now is a way of taking blood from the crab on board the vessel, and we collect a whole bunch of other data from these crabs. And then we can use a molecular tool called a PCR assay, looking for the DNA of the parasite. And everywhere there's a nice white glow here, the crab is infected. These other columns are uninfected. So this is a tool that we can sample literally thousands upon thousands of crabs a year. And in our project, we now sample 6,000 crabs a year from Atlantic Canada. This tool is very sensitive, very specific, and relatively inexpensive. So we bring the blood back from the field and go and look at it. So this is what's happened with this parasite, originally seen in 1932 in France. Again, warm water, cold water, and fresh water, cool water in the saltwater environment. So nothing much happened. We see this parasite sitting over there in France until probably the late 70s. Can't click it through any faster, I'm afraid. But the point is, as you'll see when we get to the late 70s, early 80s, literally start to explode across the world, and we don't know why. We think it's related to global climate change. And away we go. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, even down to Australia. So this is bitter crab disease blown across the world. And as of 2009, we now recognize it off the northern coast of Alaska, down here in Nova Scotia, in Japan and in Kamchatka Peninsula, and it's unofficial, and I can't put the blue spot on board, but we now know this does occur in crabs in Oregon as well. So literally this parasite that causes bitter crab has blown across the world, and we're concerned about that. And what this has led to this project, and this is a very busy slide on purpose. I'm the team leader with three scientists from ABC Lobster Science Center, Andrea Battison, who's a clinical pathologist, Spencer, who's here, who's a molecular biologist and parasitologist with a veterinary training. Earl Daw is a research scientist of snow crabs from St. John's, Newfoundland. Frank Murato is a pathobiologist in Seattle, Washington. And we were funded and are funded by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council for the next 3 years, $360,000 from NSERC, $15,000 a year from the Canadian Centre for Fisheries Innovation. The total in-kind contribution from fish, food, and allied workers, which I think is a real coup to be able to work directly with the fishermen and processors, and from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the total value of our project is $15.7 million a year, or $15.7 million over 3 years. So it's and what we're trying to do is to look at bitter crab disease in the Canadian snow crabs. There's lots and lots and lots of unknowns, a multidisciplinary project. And it's really great to be able to do that. But to give you an idea, off the north coast of Newfoundland, we recognize that the parasite is very common in these snow crabs. And the big challenge is it impacting mortality? We also recognize it's a parasite. This is Prevalence. It's an important parasite, a common parasite in small crabs. So is this affecting the population recruitment? And then most recently, as of last fall, and actually this fall, we now recognize in the little red dots that the parasite does occur in the Scotian shelf. So our budget is allowing us to sample 4,000 crabs annually from various parts of Newfoundland, Labrador, 1,000 crabs a year from Nova Scotia, and more recently now we will be looking at 1,000 crabs a year from New Brunswick. And the important thing is that this will allow the fisheries biologists to look and see whether or not this parasite and its disease is an important mortality factor in the fishery. We always think about overfishing, we always think about the gear we use, and it's only recently that we now recognize that infectious disease can be important in the mortality of crustaceans such as crabs. And what's happened up in the Bering Sea is that the warm water, or the shallow water crab, the snow crab, the green, is now moving into the deep water because the bottom temperatures are getting warmer, and the crab doesn't like that warm water, so it's moving across into deeper waters. And this is one of the effects of global climate change. And similarly, this just demonstrates that the parasite likes it when it's warm. In contrast, the crabs like it when it's cold. And also that the parasite likes to do well in shallow waters, and shallow waters are always warmer. The parasite has a very complicated life cycle, as far as we can figure out. And what we're trying to do is to reproduce what was done in 1998 and see how this relates to the life cycle of the crab. If we cut a crab open and look, there's all kinds of different parasite stages that are present. What are those stages? How are they important in causing disease in the crab? And how does the parasite get from crab to crab? A big challenge. Most of this has to be done in the laboratories. This is one of the ideas on the life cycle of a crab and its parasite, but we're not sure if this is true or not. There are lots and lots of little questions, well, some are bigger than others, that we are trying to handle right now. So, what is the life cycle of the parasite that causes disease? Is there more than one species of the parasite? Can the parasite, for example, go from the snow crab into the lobster? And even if it goes from snow crabs into lobsters, does it cause disease in lobsters? And finally, what is the impact of bitter crab on snow crab populations? And this is the big starting point that we have to deal with. What is a healthy crab? Now, here I don't have the crabs, I have the lobsters, because we spent 10 years now, or more actually, 15 years working on lobsters, and we're slowly getting to the point where we can answer the question, what is a healthy crab? So what we've done with lobsters at the center is being applied to the snow crabs. Say this is what we're doing, monitoring the disease, looking at the molecular biology of Hematodinium, that's led by Spencer, growing the parasites in plastic bottles, looking at them in the live animal experiments. That's work that Andrea and I are doing together with our graduate students. But product quality, the bitter taste, is not being done here. We have a project proposal developed by the PI Food Technology Center, but our fishermen in Atlantic Canada aren't interested in that because we don't have crabs with bitter taste because we harvest them in the summer. But the Bering Sea fishermen are very interested in this. What is the source of the taste? And even if the crabs are infected and have bitter taste, can we process them and remove that taste? So that project will likely be done with funds from the state of Alaska. I've talked about some of the people at the beginning, but myself and Andrea and Frank and Earl, we represent only a small team. There's a very large team that's focused on bitter crab disease. It's sort of like herding cats. I'm the coordinator. We have lots of email correspondence. We have developed a virtual research environment through the library, and also we have conference calls trying to keep our heads on straight, and then we're going to have an in-house workshop next spring. So the bottom line is I hope in the next couple, 3 years that we will have answered the question whether or not bitter crab disease is important to the fishery, primarily in Atlantic Canada. As I say, it's a huge fishery in our part of the world, but also through the collaboration that we're doing with what's happening up in Alaska. Thank you.